She stands and looks out at the rain-swept road. She is at the bus stop across from Masiak Terminal. Huge goods vans thunder past, speeding along in the fast lane. The raindrops drum against her umbrella so forcefully it seems they might rip through the material. She isn't really young anymore, and it would be difficult to call her beauty exactly. The curve of her neck is quite attractive, and the look in her eyes is open and friendly. She wears light, natural-looking makeup, and her white blouse is neat, uncreased. Thanks to that smart impression which one might reasonably expect to attract curiosity, attention is deflected away from the faint shadows clouding her face. Her eyes glimmer briefly. The bus she has been waiting for has appeared in the distance. She steps down into the road. She watches as the bus, which had been tearing along at a great pace, slows
down.
You're going to Cheongsong Psychiatric Hospital, right? The bus driver, in late middle age, nods to her and motions her up. She pays the fare, and as she scans the bus for somewhere to sit, her eyes pass over the faces of the other passengers. They are all watching her closely. Is she a patient, or is she a nurse? There doesn't seem to be anything odd about her. Well used to this, she keeps her eyes averted from those probing gazes, that mix of suspicion, caution, repugnance, and curiosity. She shakes the water off her folded umbrella. The floor of the bus is already wet, black and glistening. It wasn't the kind of rain for which an umbrella could provide sufficient shelter, and so her blouse and trousers are half soaked. The bus picks up speed, racing along the wet road. She struggles to keep her balance as she walks down the aisle. Finding a double seat where both spaces are unoccupied, she takes the one next to the window. The windows have steamed up, so she gets a tissue out of her bag and wipes a patch clear. She watches the streaks of rain lashing the window, with the untouched steadiness unique to those accustomed to solitude. As they reach Masiak, the late June woods begin to unfurl on either side of the road. There is something battened down about the woods in this torrential rain, like a huge animal suppressing a roar. As it turns up the road to Cheongsong Mountain, the road gradually narrows and becomes winding, bringing the wet body of the woods undulating nearer. The base of that mountain over there, might those be the woods where, 3 months ago, her sister, Yeong-hye, had been found? One by one, the black spaces between the trees, concealed by the shaking canopy of rain-lashed leaves, pass in front of her eyes. She turns away from the window. The hospital staff told her that Yeong-hye had gone missing sometime during the hour that was set aside for the patients to take brief, unaccompanied walks between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. This happened only on fixed days, only for non-serious patients, and only when the rain swelling the black clouds overhead seemed likely to stay there. Apparently, when the nurses had checked on the patients at 3, they'd been able to confirm that Yeong-hye hadn't come back. It was only then they said that the rain had finally begun to spit, just 1 or 2 drops at a time. The entire hospital staff were put on emergency. The management and staff hurriedly set up a roadblock on the corner where the buses and taxis went past. When a patient went missing, one possibility was that they had gone down from the mountains and already got as far as Masiak, or the opposite possibility, that they had, in fact, gone deeper into the mountains. The rain had gradually grown heavier as the afternoon wore on. This was March, so when darkness fell, it did so very swiftly. It was extremely lucky that one of the nurses, who between them had fanned out and searched every inch of the neighboring mountain, did manage to find Yeong-hye. No, in fact, it was nothing short of a miracle. That was what the doctor had said. Apparently, this nurse had stumbled upon Yeong-hye in an isolated spot deep in the woods covering the mountain slope, standing there stock-still and soaked with rain as if she herself were one of the glistening trees. When she got the call saying Yeong-hye had disappeared, which came around 4 in the afternoon, she'd been with her son, Ji-woo, who was 6 years old. The boy had been running a temperature for several days at that point, and she'd taken him to have his lungs x-rayed. He was standing alone in front of the machine, glancing back and forth between her and the doctor. Apprehensive. Ms. Kim Yeong-hye? Speaking. I'm Kim Yeong-hye's nurse. This was the first time since Yeong-hye had been admitted that someone from the hospital had contacted her on her mobile. She herself called them only rarely, to check visiting times or occasionally to ask her sister whether everything was okay. In a composed tone of voice designed to conceal the urgency of the situation, the nurse informed her that Yeong-hye was missing. We're doing all we can to find her, but if by chance she turns up at your home, you have to call us right away. Before she hung up, the nurse asked, is there anywhere else she might possibly have gone? Perhaps to your parents? They live out in the countryside. I can contact them if you need me to. She flipped the phone, closed and put it in her bag, went into the X-ray room and hugged Ji-woo. He'd lost weight over the past few days, and his body felt light and hot in her arms. I did really well, Mum. Perhaps it was just because of the fever, but his face seemed flushed with the expectation of praise. That's right, he really didn't move a muscle. After the doctor told her she didn't think it was pneumonia, she hugged Ji-woo again, bundled him into a taxi, and was driven home in the rain. She hurriedly washed him, gave him rice porridge and medicine, and put him to bed early. There was no room in her thoughts for her missing sister. She hadn't been able to sleep properly for the 5 days her son had been ill. And that night, if the fever didn't abate, she would have to take him to be admitted to the general hospital. She was packing Jiwoo's clothes and making sure she had his medical insurance certificate, just in case the need did arise, when the phone rang again. This had been sometime around 9 in the evening. We've found her. Thank goodness. I'll come and visit next week as normal. Her thanks were sincere, but subdued by fatigue. Only after she had hung up did it occur to her that the rain she had seen all day must have been pouring down on the mountain where Yeong-hye had been found too. An indiscriminate connection. Their existences briefly aligned. There was no way for her to judge the accuracy of the scene she saw then in her mind's eye, but had never seen in reality. She'd held a wet flannel to her snuffling son's forehead all night, slipping occasionally into a sleep that was more like fainting, and saw a tree flickering in the rain like the spirit of some dead person. Black rain, black woods, the pale patient's uniform, soaked through wet hair, black mountain slope. Yeong-hye, an inchoate mass formed of darkness and water, standing tall, like a ghost. Eventually the day dawned, and when she placed the palm of her hand on her son's forehead, she was relieved by the coolness she felt there. She got up, went out of the bedroom, and stared blankly at the bluish half-light leaching in from the living room veranda. She curled up on the sofa and tried to sleep. She had to get some sleep before Ji-woo woke up, even if it was only an hour. Look, sister, I'm doing a handstand. Leaves are growing out of my body, roots are sprouting out of my hands, they delve down into the earth. Endlessly, yes, I spread my legs because I wanted flowers to bloom from my crotch. I spread them wide. Yeong-hye's voice, which came to her while she was suspended in that halfway state between sleep and wakefulness, was low and warm at first, then innocent like that of a young child. But the last part was mangled, inaudible, a distorted animal sound. Her eyes snapped open in fright, and she was stung by a waking hatred the likes of which she'd never felt before being thrown back into sleep. This time she was standing in front of the bathroom mirror. In the reflection, blood was trickling from her left eye. She quickly reached up to wipe the blood away, but somehow her reflection in the mirror didn't move an inch, only stood there, blood running from a staring eye. She swung herself up at the sound of Ji-woo's coughing and went into the bedroom. Yeong-hye had sat there hunched in a corner of the room a long time ago, but now she pushed that image from her mind and clasped her son's small hand, lifting it up as if playing a game. It's okay now, she muttered, but it wasn't clear who these words were intended to comfort, the boy or herself. The bus pulls over as it turns up the hill. She steps down and opens her umbrella. She is the only passenger alighting here. Without delay, the bus races off down the road. The narrow road splits here. One road goes up over the hill. You pass through a tunnel around 50 meters in length. When you emerge, the other side of the small hospital is visible, flanked by mountains on all sides. The rain is still pouring down, its measured cacophony slightly less vicious. She bends down. As she rolls up her trousers to keep them out of the wet, she notices the flax leaf fleabane that is broken through the asphalt here and there. She adjusts her heavy bag, trying to ease her shoulders, puts up the umbrella, and starts walking toward the hospital. These days she goes every Wednesday to see how her sister is getting on, but before that rainy day, when Yeong-hye went missing, once a month had seemed sufficient. She had walked this road, carrying all manner of snacks, fruit, rice cakes, fried tofu stuffed with vinegared rice. It was desolate, with no sign of either vehicles or pedestrians. When she spread out the food on the table in the visiting room, Yeong-hye would silently go through the motions of chewing and swallowing, like a child diligently tackling homework. If she tucked Yeong-hye's hair behind her ears, her sister would look up at her and smile quietly. These were the moments when there might have been nothing at all. The moments that never failed to lighten her heart. Might it be okay, after all, for Yeong-hye to live like this indefinitely? Here, where she didn't have to speak if she didn't want to, didn't have to eat meat if the thought repulsed her? Couldn't the two of them get along just fine with these occasional visits? Yeong-hye was 4 years younger than her, enough of an age gap for them not to have been in competition with each other growing up. As small children, their young cheeks were frequently left throbbing by their heavy-handed father, and Yeong-hye had provoked in In-hye a sense of responsibility that resembled maternal affection, a need to expend all her energy in looking out for this younger sister. She had watched, marveling, as this same sister, once up to her elbows in the dirt, and suffering from a recurring heat rash on the backs of her knees, grew up and got married. The one thing that caused her distress was that, as she got older, Yeong-hye became more and more taciturn. She'd always had this side to her, of course, but she had also been perfectly cheerful and sociable when the occasion called for it. Somehow, not suddenly, but over a period of time, she became difficult to read. So difficult that there were times when she seemed like a total stranger. A day or two after Jiwoo was born, when Yeong-hye came to the hospital to say hello to her first nephew, rather than congratulating her sister, she had simply muttered to herself, "I've never seen such a tiny child, so this is what they're like when they've just been born." There'd been something faintly unsettling about the quiet smile playing around Yeong-hye's mouth. What seemed to be happening was that Yeong-hye was retreating from herself, becoming as distant to herself as she was to her sister. A forlorn face, behind a mask of composure. This was clearly nothing like the melancholy that sometimes afflicted her husband, and yet in certain respects they were both baffling to her in exactly the same way. They were both descending further into silence. She enters the tunnel. It's darker inside than usual, on account of the weather. She closes her umbrella and walks. She listens to the ringing echoes of her footsteps. A large speckled moth, a type she's never seen before, flutters up off the surface of the wall, into a darkness saturated with damp. She pauses for a while, looks up at its beating wings. But on the pitch-black tunnel ceiling, the moth stays put, as though conscious of being observed. Her husband liked to film flying things. Birds, butterflies, airplanes, moths, flies. These scenes of flight, which he always seemed to have inserted into a piece despite an apparent lack of connection to the overall subject, had confused her. She was a layperson when it came to art. Once, she'd asked him why he'd included a particular scene, a 2-second clip of the black shadow of a bird soaring slowly up into the air, which he'd put after a scene of a ruined bridge and people crying at a funeral. Just because, had been his answer. I just ended up putting it in. I put it in, and I thought it looked good. And then that familiar silence. Had she ever really understood her husband's true nature, bound up as it was with that seemingly Impenetrable silence? She'd thought, at one time, that it might be revealed in his work, in his video. Art. In fact, before she met him, she hadn't even been aware that such a field of art existed. Despite her best efforts, though, his works proved incomprehensible to her. Nothing was revealed. She remembers the late afternoon when they first met. He'd come into her shop, skinny as a sorghum stalk and with several days' worth of stubble on his face, a camcorder bag slung over one shoulder that was clearly weighing him down. He searched out some shaving lotion, brought it to the counter, and rested both arms on the glass, looking utterly worn out. He looked like he might collapse and take the counter with him. It was faintly miraculous the way she, having had practically no romantic experiences up until then, came out with a friendly, "Have you had lunch?" as if surprised, but lacking the energy required to express that surprise. He had merely fixed her face with his exhausted gaze. Something in his defenseless state had drawn her to him. What she'd wanted from that afternoon had been to use her own strength to allow him to rest. But despite devoting herself wholeheartedly to this goal, even after they were married, he still looked perpetually worn out. He was always busy with his own things, and during what little time he did spend at home, he looked more like a traveler putting up there for a night than a man in his own home. His silence had the heavy mass of rock and the tenacious resistance of rubber, particularly when his art wasn't going well. It wasn't long before she realized something. Perhaps the one she'd so earnestly wanted to help was not him, but herself. Was it not perhaps her own image, she who had left home at 19 and gone on to make a life for herself in Seoul, always entirely under her own steam, that she had seen mirrored in this man's exhaustion? Just as she could not be certain of the source of her affection for him, or if he was really its true object, she had never been entirely sure of his feelings for her. He often seemed to rely on her, being the type for whom daily life was a constant struggle, full of potential pitfalls. He was honest to the point of seeming naive. Exaggeration or flattery was entirely beyond him. But to her he was always kind, never once raised his voice in anger, and indeed would sometimes give her a look of great respect. "I don't deserve you," he used to say before they were married. "Your goodness, your stability, how calm you always are, the way you just get on with things and make it look so easy." Respect, that was what she'd taken his words to connote, but might they not in fact have been intended as a confession that whatever it was he felt for her, it was nothing even remotely resembling love? Perhaps the only things he truly loved were his images, those he'd filmed, or then again, perhaps, only those he had yet to film. The first time she went to one of his exhibitions after they were married, she was taken aback. She couldn't believe that this man, who had looked as though he might be about to collapse, had carted his camcorder around all these various places, with all the difficulties that must have involved. Indeed, it was hard for her even to imagine how he'd managed to negotiate to be allowed to film in sensitive places, the courage and sheer nerve he must at times have had to display, the patient perseverance that seemed so at odds with everything she knew about him. What it all came down to was that she just couldn't believe he'd been sufficiently passionate about the project to put himself through all that. There was one time that stuck in her memory. It had been a little after Ji-woo's first birthday, when the boy was just beginning to walk. Her husband had used his camcorder to film Ji-woo tottering around the sunny living room. He'd filmed Ji-woo suddenly being scooped up into her arms, her lips pressed to the crown of the boy's head. "Every time Ji-woo takes another step," he said, his eyes sparkling with life, yet somehow inscrutable, "how about I make an animation so flowers spring up from his footsteps, like in that Hayao Miyazaki film?" "No, not flowers, butterflies would be better." In that case we should film it again on a lawn." He showed her how to operate the camcorder, played back the scenes he'd just filmed, all while rattling on excitedly about his ideas for the piece. And he'll have to wear white clothes." "No, wait, how about if the clothes were really shabby, old and worn?" Yes, of course, that's it. A poor mother and child on an outing. the multicolored butterflies that fly up like a miracle every time the baby takes an unsteady step. But they didn't have a lawn. Plus, Jiwoo soon grew out of the unsteady tottering phase. The video of butterflies flying up from the child's footsteps never became a reality. From a certain point onward, he began to work himself even harder than before. He shut himself up in the studio, not even coming home in the evenings or at weekends, and yet he never seemed to have anything to show for it. He wandered the streets until his sneakers turned black. Sometimes, when she woke in the early hours and went into the bathroom, she was startled to find him there, curled up in the empty bathtub, still in his clothes and sound asleep. After her husband left them, Jiwoo would often ask her, "Is there a dad in our family?" It was the question he'd asked her every morning, even when her husband was still around, so infrequently did the boy actually see him. "No," she would answer shortly. And then, soundlessly, "No one at all. There's only you and me. That will have to be enough now." In the rain, the hospital buildings stand dreary and forlorn. Their gray concrete walls appear darker and more solid than usual. The wards on the first and third floors have iron bars over the windows. Many of the patients liked to stick their faces between the bars. On bright days, it was difficult to make them out, but with the weather like this, several gray faces could be seen staring out at the rain. She glances up briefly to the windows of Yeong-hye's third-floor ward annex, then walks inside and heads toward reception. "I've got an appointment to see Dr. Park and Ho." The receptionist greets her, recognizing her from previous visits. She closes her dripping umbrella and secures the tie around it, then sits down on a long wooden bench while she waits for the doctor to come down from the consultation room. She turns to look at the Zelkova tree that stands in the hospital's front garden. The tree is clearly very old, easily 400 years. On bright days it would spread its countless branches and let the sunlight scintillate its leaves, seemingly communicating something to her. Today, a day sodden and stupefied with rain, it is reticent and keeps its thoughts unspoken. The old bark on its lower part is dark as a drenched evening, and the leaves tremble silently on the twigs as the raindrops batter down on them. And she sees her sister's face, flickering like a ghostly afterimage overlaid on the silent scene. She closes her bloodshot eyes for a long time before opening them again. The tree fills her field of vision, still silent, keeping its own counsel. Still, she cannot sleep. It's been 3 months straight now. 3 months of getting by, snatching pockets of sleep here and there, never more than an hour at any one time. Yeong-hye's voice, the forest with the black rain falling, and her own face with the blood trickling from her eye, shiver the long night into fragments like potsherds. Usually, when she has given up on trying to wring any more sleep out of the night, it is around 3 in the morning. She washes her face, brushes her teeth, prepares some side dishes, cleans and tidies every corner of the house, and still the clock goes as slow as ever, the shifting of the hands like the almost comically suspended movements of some ponderous dance. In the end, she goes into his room and listens to some of the records he left behind, or puts her hand on her back and spins herself around the room as he once had, or curls up in the bathtub with her clothes on, and even feels for the first time as though he mightn't have been so incomprehensible after all. He probably just hadn't had the energy to take his clothes off, simple as that. He simply can't have had the energy to adjust the water temperature and take a shower. It struck her that this narrow, concave space was, oddly enough, cozier than anywhere else in the entire apartment. When did all of this begin? She sometimes asked herself in such moments. No, when did it all begin to fall apart? Yeong-hye's increasingly odd behavior had become noticeable around 3 years ago, when she'd suddenly decided to turn vegetarian. She lost so much weight it was quite shocking to look at her, and she practically stopped sleeping altogether. Yes, she'd always been quiet, but at that time she would say so little that any kind of meaningful communication was impossible. The whole family had been extremely concerned, their parents in particular. All this had happened shortly after In-hye and her husband had moved with Ji-woo to a new apartment. At the housewarming, when the whole family had got together, their father had struck Yeong-hye in the face, held her mouth open, and forced a lump of meat inside. In-hye's body had jerked violently, as though she herself were the one receiving the blow. She'd stood and watched, stiff as a ramrod, while Yeong-hye howled like an animal and spat out the meat, then picked up the fruit knife and slit her own wrist. Wasn't there something she could have done to prevent it? Again and again, doubts raced through her mind. Was there really nothing she could have done to stop their father's hand that day? Or to get the knife out of Yeong-hye's hand before she had time to hurt herself? Couldn't she have prevented her husband from being the one to pick up the bleeding Yeong-hye and rush her to hospital? And then, once Yeong-hye had been admitted to the psychiatric hospital, surely she could have dissuaded her husband, Mr. Chong, from coldly casting her aside. Above all, that terrible thing that her own husband had done to Yeong-hye, that thing she wanted to put as far from her mind as possible. Couldn't she have talked him out of it, found a way to make him change his mind before the whole thing descended into a cheap, tawdry scandal? The lives of all the people around her had tumbled down like a house of cards. Was there really nothing else she could have done? Of course, there'd been no way for her to guess what ideas her casual mention of that small, blue Mongolian mark would spark in her husband. But shouldn't she have been able to at least make a guess as to the way things were heading? Hadn't his recent behavior given her sufficient clues? Could she have found a way to impress on him that Yeong-hye was still on medication, was still ill? The only thing clear to her was that what her husband had done was unforgivable. It wasn't until past noon that first her husband and then Yeong-hye had awakened, followed quickly by the 3 paramedics rushing into the flat, concealing straitjackets and protective equipment. 2 of them had immediately gone over to Yeong-hye, who had been leaning precariously out over the veranda railing. She resisted violently as they tried to slip the straitjacket on over her naked, paint-mottled body, biting their arms savagely and letting out an incomprehensible roar. Despite her struggles, they managed to insert an 4-needle into her forearm. While all this was going on, her husband had tried to get around the other paramedic, who was standing by the front door, but the man easily caught hold of him. Using all his strength to tear himself free, he whipped around and, without a moment's pause, ran out onto the veranda. He tried to throw himself over the railing. The quick-footed paramedic got hold of him around the waist just in time, and after that, he didn't struggle anymore. She had stood there, trembling from head to foot, as she watched all this unfold. Eventually, when her husband was being dragged away and their eyes met, she stared at him as hard as she could. But what she saw in his eyes was neither lust nor insanity, regret nor resentment. There was nothing there, except the same terror she herself was feeling. And that was how it all ended. That afternoon, which marked the point after which their lives could never go back to the way they'd been before. Her husband had been held in a police cell after the hospital confirmed that he wasn't mentally ill. It took several months of tedious lawsuits and official inquiries before he was released, after which he went immediately into hiding. She never saw him again. But Yeong-hye's condition was such that she had to remain in the closed ward. After her initial bout of mental illness, she'd returned to the stage where she was able to speak to others, only to now withdraw into silence once more. But it wasn't simply that she didn't engage in conversation. Back in the closed ward, she'd taken to squatting down in a sunny spot where she wouldn't be disturbed and muttering incessantly to herself. As before, she refused to eat meat, and if she so much as set eyes on a side dish containing meat, she would scream and try to run away. On sunny days, she would press herself up against the window, unbutton her hospital gown, and bare her breasts to the sun. Their parents, whom the whole sorry saga seemed to have greatly aged, didn't make any further effort to visit Yeong-hye, and even severed contact with their elder daughter, In-hye, who reminded them of the despicable way they'd treated Yeong-hye. The 2 sisters' younger brother, Yeong-hye, and his wife were no different. But she, In-hye could not bring herself to abandon Yeong-hye. Someone had to pay the hospital fees, someone had to act as her carer. And she got by, as she always had done, despite the scandal hanging over her, steadfastly refusing to disappear. She made sure that the shop kept running. Time was a wave, almost cruel in its relentlessness as it whisked her life downstream, a life she had to constantly strain to keep from breaking apart. Ji-woo, who had been 5 that autumn, was now 6, and Yeong-hye, who had been transferred to a hospital where the environment was good and the fees were reasonable, looked to have greatly improved. Even as a child, In-hye had possessed the innate strength of character necessary to make one's own way in life. As a daughter, as an older sister, as a wife, and as a mother, as the owner of a shop, even as an underground passenger on the briefest of journeys, she had always done her best. Through the sheer inertia of a life lived in this way, she would have been able to conquer everything, even time. If only Yeong-hye hadn't suddenly disappeared last March. If only she hadn't been discovered in the forest that rainy night. If only all of her symptoms hadn't suddenly got worse. Preceded by the sound of quick, purposeful footsteps, a young doctor, wearing a white gown, approaches from the other end of the corridor. He sketches a shallow bow when In-hye stands up to greet him, gesturing toward the consulting room with an expansive sweep of his arm. She follows him. Inside, the doctor, who is in his late 30s, has a healthy, robust physique. The set of his jaw and his manner of walking speak of a certain self-confidence. He sits behind the desk and stares over it at her, his brow furrowed. Sensing that the tone of the discussion will not be positive, she feels her heart become heavy. My sister, we've done our very best, but her condition hasn't improved. In that case, today, she blushes as if having committed some embarrassing blunder. The doctor doesn't wait for her to continue. Today we'll try feeding her intravenously, and if we're lucky, her condition might improve just a little. Otherwise, there'll be nothing else for it but to transfer her to one of the critical wards at the general hospital. Before that, would it be all right for me to try to talk to her, to make her see sense? She asks. His eyes show that he holds no great hopes for her attempts at persuasion. He seems worn out, trying to conceal the anger he feels toward those patients who fail to live up to his expectations. He glances at his watch. I'll give you around 30 minutes. If you're successful, please let them know. In the nurse's room. Otherwise, I'll see you at 2. She expects him to get up immediately and sweep out of the room, but instead he chooses to drag the conversation out a little longer, perhaps mindful of having been a little abrupt. I know I told you this last time, but 15 to 20% of anorexia nervosa patients will starve to death. Even when they're down to nothing but skin and bone, the subject is still convinced that they've put on weight. There can be all manner of psychological factors at play, a power struggle with a domineering mother, for example, but Kim Yeong-hye's is one of those particular cases where the subject refuses to eat while suffering from schizophrenia. We were confident that her schizophrenia wasn't serious. There was honestly no way for us to predict that things would turn out the way they have. In cases where the subject is paranoid about being poisoned, they can usually be reasoned with. Or else the doctor can eat the food in front of them, let them see that it's fine. But we're still not sure exactly why it is that Kim Yeong-hye is refusing to eat, and none of the medicines we've given her seem to have had any effect. It wasn't an easy decision for us to make, but there's no other way. Our first duty as doctors is to preserve life, and we simply can't be sure of keeping her alive here. The doctor makes as if to stand up, then hesitates. Your complexion doesn't look healthy. Are you not sleeping well? His question seems motivated by professional habit, and she cannot think of a quick answer. Carers have to look after their own health too, you know. They exchange bows. Then the doctor opens the door and strides away. By the time she leaves the room, his retreating figure is already disappearing down the corridor. When she returns to the long bench in front of the reception desk, a flashily dressed middle-aged woman is just coming in through the front door, on the arm of a similarly aged man. Have they come to visit a patient? The next instant, an unbroken stream of invective starts pouring forth from the woman's mouth. Seemingly well accustomed to her cursing, the man pays no attention as he gets the medical insurance certificate out of his wallet and slides it under the window at the reception desk. Wicked little shits. You won't be satisfied even when you've sucked my insides dry. I'm going to emigrate. I can't spend another day with shits like you. If the process of admittance is completed in time, the woman will probably end up spending the night in the secure room. More than likely, her limbs will be bound and a tranquilizer will be administered. Yeong-hye stares at the garish flower-patterned hat worn by this shrieking woman. All of a sudden, she realizes how blasé she's become when it comes to the mentally ill. In fact, after all these visits to the hospital, sometimes it's the tranquil streets filled with so-called normal people that end up seeming strange. She remembers the day she first brought Yeong-hye here. A bright afternoon in early winter. The closed ward of Seoul General Hospital was actually quite near her house, but the admittance fee was more than she could scrape together, so she'd asked around a bit before settling on this hospital, where the treatment was apparently quite good. It was when she'd met with the doctor at the other hospital, who wanted Yeong-hye to be discharged, that she'd been advised to consider outpatient care. So far, the results that we've observed directly have been good. She probably isn't in a position yet to return to any kind of social life, but the support of her family will be a great help. That's what I was told last time, too, she told him. I believed it and had Yeong-hye discharged. But now it seems like that was the wrong thing to do. Though the ostensible reason for her not wanting Yeong-hye to be discharged, the reason that she gave the doctor, was this worry about a possible relapse. Now she was able to admit to herself what had really been going on. She was no longer able to cope with all that her sister reminded her of. She'd been unable to forgive her for soaring alone over a boundary she herself could never bring herself to cross, unable to forgive that magnificent irresponsibility that had enabled Yeong-hye to shuck off social constraints and leave her behind, still a prisoner. And before Yeong-hye had broken those bars, she'd never even known they were there. Luckily, Yeong-hye was in favor of being admitted, dressed in everyday clothes and telling the doctor in a distinct voice that she was comfortable there in the hospital. She had seemed calm. The look in her eyes was clear, and the set of her mouth was firm. It was almost impossible to tell her. Apart from ordinary people, aside, of course, from the fact that, skinny to begin with, she was at that point alarmingly thin. In the taxi on the way there, she'd gazed quietly out of the window, showing not even the slightest hint of unease, and when they sent the taxi away, she'd obediently followed her sister, as though they'd simply come out for a stroll. She'd looked so normal that the receptionist had actually had to ask which one of them was the patient. While they waited for Yeong-hye's documents to be processed, Yeong-hye said to her sister, "The air is good here. It'll give you more of an appetite. You'll be able to eat a bit more and put on some weight." Yeong-hye, who at the time was just beginning to speak again, cast her gaze toward the Zelkova tree on the other side of the window and said, "Yes, there are big trees here." Having been called down by the receptionist, a strong-looking middle-aged nurse came and checked through their hospital bag. Underclothes, everyday clothes, slippers, toiletries. He spread the clothes out carefully, going through them one by one, seemingly to check that there weren't any strings or pins. He removed the long, thick woolen belt from the coat Yeong-hye had packed and asked the two of them to follow him. The nurse unlocked the door to the 6-person ward and led them in. Yeong-hye remained composed as her sister greeted each of the nurses in turn. Eventually, she set the hospital bag down and went over to the window, which had a heavy-looking set of bars running vertically across it. Just then, she was discomfited to find herself struck by a guilty conscience, which she'd so far managed to avoid. Suddenly, it was there like a lump in her chest, weighing her down. Yeong-hye walked up soundlessly and stood beside her. You can see the trees from here too. You will not be weak," Yeong-hye told herself, her lips pressed tightly together. At any rate, she is a burden you cannot bear. No one blames you. You've done well to make it this far. She didn't look at Yeong-hye as she stood beside her. Instead, she looked down at the bright early winter sunlight as it splintered over the larches, which had not yet shed all their leaves. Sister, Yeong-hye said, her voice low and calm as if intending to comfort her. Yeong-hye's old black sweater gave off the faint scent of mothballs. When In-hye didn't answer, Yeong-hye whispered, "One more time. Sister, all the trees of the world are like brothers and sisters." She walks past the second annex and stops in front of the door to the first annex. She sees the patients pressing themselves against the glass door and peering outside. They're probably feeling a bit claustrophobic, the rain having kept them cooped up inside for the past few days. When In-hye presses the bell, a nurse in his late 30s comes out from the nurse's room by the ground floor lobby, carrying a key. The nurse closes the door quickly behind him, inserts the key, and locks it. In-hye notices a young female patient staring out at her, her cheek pressed against the inside of the locked glass door. Her two empty eyes scrutinize In-hye as though trying to bore through her skin. There was no way she could look at a stranger like that if her mind were sound. "How is my sister at the moment?" she asks as they climb the stairs to the third floor. The nurse looks back over his shoulder and shakes his head. She stopped talking. "She's also been trying to pull the 4-needle out, so we had to get her into the secure room and give her a tranquilizer before we could put it back in. How she has the strength to shake us off. So she's in the secure room now?" "No. She woke up a little while ago, so we moved her back to the ward." "They told you they're putting the nasal drip in at 2, right?" She follows the nurse into the third floor lobby. On fine days, there are elderly patients sitting on the long bench by the window and soaking up the sun, others engrossed in a game of table tennis. Cheery music filtering in from the nurse's room. But today all of that liveliness seems to have been smothered by the incessant rain. Perhaps because the majority of the patients are in their wards, there isn't much going on in the lobby. The table tennis bats lie unused on the table. She looks down along the ward's western corridor, where, right at the end, the afternoon sunlight shines through the large window more brightly than in any other spot on sunny days. When In-hye came to see Yeong-hye last March, just a few days before the latter disappeared into the rainy woods, Yeong-hye refused to come to the visiting room. When In-hye contacted the head nurse from reception, the nurse said that, oddly enough, Yeong-hye hadn't wanted to leave the ward for several days now. Even during the hour when an unaccompanied walk was permitted, a time that all the patients always looked forward to, she'd kept to the ward. When In-hye asked if she could just go and look at her sister's face, given that she'd come all this way, the nurse came down to reception to accompany her. When she came upon the unexpected sight of a female patient doing a handstand at the far end of the western corridor, it never even crossed her mind that it might be Yeong-hye. Only when the nurse, with whom she'd just spoken on the telephone, guided her in that direction, had she been able to recognize Yeong-hye's long, thick hair. Her sister was upside down and balancing on her hands, her face flushed almost puce. "She's been at it for 30 minutes already," the nurse said, seeming impatient. "It started 2 days ago. It's not that she isn't aware of her surroundings or that she doesn't speak. She's different from the other catatonic patients. Up until yesterday, we'd been having to force her back into the ward. But no matter what we did, she just started up with the handstands again as soon as she was in the ward. So we can't even force her to stop." Before he went back to the nurse's room, the nurse said, "She'll fall over if you give her a little nudge. Give it a try if you can't get her to talk to you." We would have had to push her over to get her back in the ward. Anyway, left alone with Yeong-hye, In-hye squatted down and tried to look her sister in the eye. Anyone's face will look different when they're upside down. Yeong-hye's face certainly looked odd, with what little flesh she had on her cheeks pushed down toward her eyes. Those eyes were glittering and sharp. As Yeong-hye stared into space, she seemed unaware of her sister's presence. "Yeong-hye?" No reply. "Yeong-hye?" What are you doing? Stand up. She reached out a hand to Yeong-hye's flushed cheek. Stand up, Yeong-hye. Doesn't your head hurt? For goodness sake, your face is bright red. With nothing else for it, she gave her sister a gentle push. Just as the nurse had said, Yeong-hye immediately tumbled to the floor, and In-hye quickly lifted her head up, supporting her neck as you would with a baby. Sister. Yeong-hye's face was wreathed in smiles, her eyes shining as though she'd just woken up from a happy dream. When did you get here? The nurse, who'd been watching the two of them, came up and led them to the meeting room that adjoined the lobby. This, she explained, was where family members could meet with the patients, whose symptoms were so severe that it was difficult for them to go down to the visiting room in reception. In-hye guessed that it was also where consultations with the doctor took place. When In-hye laid the food she'd brought out on the table, Yeong-hye said, Sister, you don't have to bring that stuff now. She smiled. I don't need to eat anymore. What are you talking about? In-hye stared at her sister as though she were possessed. It was a long time since she'd seen Yeong-hye's face shining like this. No. In fact, it was the first time. What on earth were you doing just now? She asked. Yeong-hye met her question with another. Sister, did you know? Know what? I didn't, you see. I thought trees stood up straight. I only found out just now. They actually stand with both arms in the earth, all of them. Look over there. Aren't you surprised? Yeong-hye sprang up and pointed to the window. All of them. They're all standing on their heads. Yeong-hye laughed frantically. In-hye remembered moments from their childhood when Yeong-hye's face had worn the same expression as it did now. Those moments when her sister's single-lidded eyes would narrow and turn completely dark, when that innocent laughter would come rushing out of her mouth. Do you know how I found out? Well, I was in a dream, and I was standing on my head. Leaves were growing from my body, and roots were sprouting from my hands, so I dug down into the earth. On and on. I wanted flowers to bloom from my crotch, so I spread my legs. I spread them wide. Bewildered, In-hye looked across at Yeong-hye's feverish eyes. I need to water my body. I don't need this kind of food, sister. I need water. Thank you so much for all your trouble, In-hye tells the head nurse. I really appreciate it. She holds out the rice cakes she's brought and greets the other nurses in turn, while she makes her usual inquiries regarding Yeong-hye's condition. A female patient in her 50s who has mistaken her for a nurse hurries over from the window and gives her a shallow bow. My head hurts. Please tell the doctor to change my medication. I'm not a nurse. I'm here to see my sister. The woman stares deep into In-hye's eyes. Please help me. My head hurts so much I can't go on. How can I live like this? Just then a male patient in his 20s comes and presses himself against In-hye's back. It's a common enough occurrence in the hospital, but it makes her nervous all the same. The patients pay no mind to conventional ideas about personal space, or it being rude to stare at other people. On the one hand, there are many of them whose utterly blank gazes indicate minds shut up in their own private worlds, but then again there are also a certain number who appear so lucid one could easily mistake them for members of the medical staff. Yeong-hye had been one of the latter kind once. Nurse, why on earth doesn't anyone ever do anything about that guy? A familiar female patient in her 30s shouts at the head nurse, her tone aggressive. I mean, you know perfectly well how he's always hitting me. The woman's persecution mania seems to get worse every time In-hye visits. In-hye bows to the nurses again. I'll just go and have a talk with my sister. Judging by the nurses' expressions, they're all well and truly fed up with Yeong-hye. Clearly, none of them is holding out any hope that In-hye's attempts at persuasion will have the slightest effect. She threads her way out carefully between the patients, taking care not to brush against them. She walks down the eastern corridor outside Yeong-hye's ward. The door to the ward is open, and when she enters, a woman with her hair cropped short comes up to her. You're visiting today? The woman is Hee-ju, who is receiving treatment for alcoholism and hypomania. Her body is Stout, but her round eyes give her a sweet look, and her voice is always somewhat hoarse. In this hospital, the patients who are in good control of their faculties look after those with more acute psychological problems and receive a little pocket money in return. When Yeong-hye had grown difficult to manage, refusing point-blank to eat, she had come under the care of Hee-ju. "Thanks for all your trouble," In-hye says, and is about to force out a laugh when Hee-ju's slightly damp hand clasps her own. "What can we do?" Hee-ju says, her round eyes filling with tears. "They're saying Yeong-hye might die." "How has she been?" "Just now she vomited some blood. She doesn't eat, so her stomach acid is eating away at her stomach, and she constantly has these convulsions. And now this bleeding too." Hee-ju grows ever closer to the brink of tears. "When I first began to look after her, she wasn't like this. Perhaps she might have been okay if I'd taken better care of her, do you think? I didn't know she would end up like this. Perhaps this wouldn't be happening to her if I hadn't been put in charge of her." Hee-ju is working herself up, so In-hye releases her hand and slowly approaches the bed. If only one's eyes weren't visible to others, she thinks. If only one could hide one's eyes from the world. Yeong-hye is lying very straight on the bed. At first she looks as though she is gazing out of the window, but on closer inspection she actually isn't looking at anything at all. Barely any flesh remains on her face, neck, shoulders, and limbs. In-hye notices the hair growing on her sister's cheeks and forearms, fine but unusually long, like the faint down that babies often have. The doctor had explained that this was due to Yeong-hye's hormonal balance being disturbed, something that happens after a long period of starvation. Is Yeong-hye trying to turn herself back into a pre-adolescent? She hasn't had her period for a long time now, and now that her weight has dropped below 30 kilos, of course there's nothing left of her breasts. She lies there looking like a freakish, overgrown child, devoid of any secondary sexual characteristics. In-hye lifts up the white bedsheet. She turns the completely unresisting Yeong-hye over and checks that no bedsores have appeared on her coccyx or back. The area that had been inflamed last time still hasn't got any better. In-hye allows her gaze to rest on the clear, pale blue Mongolian mark imprinted in the middle of her buttocks, which are now wasted away to the bone. The image of those flowers, which had spread out from that mark like bleeding ink, covering Yeong-hye's whole body, flickers briefly, dizzyingly, in front of In-hye's eyes. "Thank you for everything, Hee-ju. Every day I wash her with a wet towel and powder her skin too. It's this damp weather that won't let it heal. Thank you so much. I used to need one of the nurses to help me give her a bath. Now she's so light, I can lift her easily on my own. It really is like caring for a baby. Anyway, I was hoping to give her a bath today as well. I heard you're moving her to a different hospital, so this would be the last time." Hee-ju's big eyes turn red again. "All right, let's give her a bath together in a little while." "Yes." The hot water comes on at 4. Hee-ju wipes her bloodshot eyes, one after the other. "All right, then I'll see you in a bit." In-hye nods to Hee-ju as the latter leaves, then covers Yeong-hye back up with a sheet, adjusting it to make sure that her sister's feet aren't sticking out. In-hye checks for burst veins and finds them everywhere, on both hands, the soles of both feet, even her elbows. The only means of providing Yeong-hye with proteins and glucose is the 4, but now there are no undamaged veins left where a needle could be put in. The only other way would be to link the 4 to one of the arteries that run over Yeong-hye's shoulders. Yesterday, the doctor phoned In-hye to explain that, as this requires a dangerous surgical operation, Yeong-hye would have to be transferred to the general hospital. They'd tried on numerous occasions to get some gruel into Yeong-hye by inserting a long tube into her nose. But this had always ended in failure as Yeong-hye had simply closed up her gullet. They would try this method one last time today, but if this too failed, then Yeong-hye would no longer be able to remain in their care. 3 months ago, just after Yeong-hye had been found in the forest, when In-hye had arrived at reception on the scheduled visiting day, She'd been told that Yeong-hye's doctor wanted to meet with her. This made her anxious, as she hadn't spoken with him since Yeong-hye had first been admitted. We know that it disturbs her psychologically if she sees a side dish containing meat, so we've been taking extra care to make sure this doesn't happen. But now she won't even come down to the lobby at mealtimes, and even if we bring a meal tray up to the ward, she won't eat. It's already been 4 days. She started to become dehydrated. And since she becomes violent every time we try to put in a drip, well, I'm not sure we can even give her the medicine properly anymore. In fact, the doctor doubted whether Yeong-hye had been taking her medication at all.
He even
blamed himself for not being as vigilant as he should have been after things had initially seemed to be going well. Just that morning, the nurse had been asked to check that Yeong-hye took her medicine, but apparently Yeong-hye hadn't listened when she'd been told to stick out her tongue. When the nurse then forced her tongue up and used a flashlight to look inside, the tablets were still there. That day back then, as Yeong-hye lay there in the ward with the drip needle inserted into the back of her hand, In-hye asked her, "Why did you do it? What were you doing in those dark woods? Wasn't it cold? What would you have done if you'd caught something? Something serious?" Yeong-hye's face was terribly haggard, and her uncombed hair was matted like seaweed. "You have to eat. I understand. You not eating meat if you don't like it, but why won't you eat other things now either?" Yeong-hye's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. "I'm thirsty," she whispered. "Give me some water." In-hye went and fetched some from the lobby. After she'd had a drink, Yeong-hye let out a shallow sigh and asked, "Did you talk to the doctor, sister?" "Yes, I did." "Why?" Yeong-hye cut her off. "They say my insides have all atrophied, you know." In-hye was lost for words. Yeong-hye moved her emaciated face closer to her sister. "I'm not an animal anymore, sister," she said, first scanning the empty ward as if about to disclose a momentous secret. "I don't need to eat, not now. I can live without it. All I need is sunlight." "What are you talking about? Do you really think you've turned into a tree? How could a plant talk? How can you think these things?" Yeong-hye's eyes shone. A mysterious smile played on her face. "You're right. Soon now, words and thoughts will all disappear. Soon." Yeong-hye burst into laughter, then sighed. "Very soon. Just a bit longer to wait, sister." Time passes. Outside the window, the rain looks to be coming down less heavily than before.
The raindrops on
the mosquito netting appear undisturbed, so perhaps the rain actually stopped a little while ago. In-hye sits down in a chair by Yeong-hye's bedside, opens her bag, and gets out various containers of different sizes, all tightly sealed. She opens the lid of the smallest container first. A sweet fragrance spreads through the humid air of the ward. "It's a peach, Yeong-hye. A tinned Wangdo peach. You like them, remember? You used to insist on buying them even when fresh peaches were in season, just like a child."
She carves off a piece of
the ripe, yielding fruit with a fork and brings it up to Yeong-hye's nose. "Smell that, don't you want to try a bit?" The next container is filled with watermelon cut up into conveniently sized cubes. "Don't you remember, when you were young, every time I cut a watermelon in half you would come and smell it? With some of them, when we cut them up they gave off this wonderful sweet smell that spread through the whole house." Yeong-hye remains entirely motionless. In-hye gently rubs a piece of melon against her sister's lips. She tries to use 2 of her fingers to part Yeong-hye's lips, but her mouth is shut tight. "Yeong-hye," In-hye says. Her voice is low. "Answer me, Yeong-hye." She shakes her sister by her stiff shoulders and resists the temptation to force her mouth open. She wants to yell right into her sister's ear. "What are you doing? Are you listening to me? Do you want to die?
Do you really want to die?"
Dazed, she examines the hot anger that is boiling up inside her like spume. Time passes. In-hye turns her head and looks out of the window. The rain seems finally to have stopped, but the sky is still overcast, the wet trees still silent. The The densely wooded slopes of Mount Cheongsong stretch far into the distance. The huge forest blanketing those slopes is as silent as everything else. She gets a thermos flask out of her bag and pours Chinese quince tea into the stainless steel cup. Try some, Yeong-hye. It's infused really well. She brings it to her own lips first and takes a sip. The taste that lingers on the tip of her tongue is sweet and fragrant. After pouring some of the tea onto a hand towel, she uses it to moisten Yeong-hye's lips. There is no response. Are you trying to die? She asks. You're not, are you? If all you want to do is become a tree, you still have to eat. You have to live. She stops speaking. Her breath catches in her throat. A suspicion that she hasn't wanted to acknowledge has finally raised its head. Might she have been mistaken? Might it be precisely that death which Yeong-hye is after, which she has been after from the first? No, she repeats silently. You're not trying to die. Before Yeong-hye stopped speaking for good, around a month ago, she had said, Sister, please let me out of here. She would often break off mid-sentence, perhaps because she found it difficult to keep talking for a long time, and her speech was mingled with the rasping sound of her breathing. People are always telling me to eat. I don't like eating. They force me. Last time I threw it up. Yesterday, as soon as I'd eaten, they gave me an injection to put me to sleep. Sister, I don't like injections. I really don't like them. Please let me out. I don't like being here. In-hye had held Yeong-hye's wasted hand and said, but you can't even walk properly anymore. It's only now that you've got this for that you're managing to keep going if you come home. Will you eat? If you promise to eat, I'll get you discharged. She couldn't fail to notice how the light went out of Yeong-hye's eyes then.
Yeong-hye.
Answer me. All you need to do is promise. Yeong-hye twisted away from her sister. You're just the same, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What are you talking about? No one can understand me. The doctors, the nurses, they're all the same. They don't even try to understand. They just force me to take medication and stab me with needles. Yeong-hye's voice was slow and quiet, but firm. In-hye couldn't hold herself back any longer.
You, she yelled.
I'm acting like this because I'm afraid you're going to die. Yeong-hye turned her head and stared blankly at In-hye, as though the latter were not her sister but a complete stranger. After a while, the question came. Why is it such a bad thing to die? Why is it such a bad thing to die? A long time ago, she and Yeong-hye had got lost on a mountain. Yeong-hye, who had been 9 at the time, said, let's just not go back. At the time, In-hye hadn't understood what she meant. What are you talking about? It'll get dark any minute now. We have to hurry up and find the path. Only after all this time was she able to understand why Yeong-hye had said what she did. Yeong-hye had been the only victim of their father's beatings. Such violence wouldn't have bothered their brother Yeong-hye so much, a boy who went around doling out his own rough justice to the village children. As the eldest daughter, In-hye had been the one who took over from their exhausted mother and made a broth for her father to wash the liquor down, and so he'd always taken a certain care in his dealings with her. Only Yeong-hye, docile and naive, had been unable to deflect their father's temper or put up any form of resistance. Instead, she had merely absorbed all her suffering inside her, deep into the marrow of her bones. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, In-hye could see that the role that she had adopted back then of the hard-working, self-sacrificing eldest daughter had been a sign, not of maturity, but of cowardice. It had been a survival tactic. Could I have prevented it? Could I have prevented those unimaginable things from sinking so deep inside of Yeong-hye and holding her in their grip? She saw her sister again, as a child, her back and shoulders and the back of her head as she stood alone in front of the main gate at sunset. The two of them had eventually made it down off the mountain, but on the opposite side from where they'd started. They'd hitched a ride on a power tiller back to their small town, hurrying along the unfamiliar road as darkness fell. In-hye had been relieved, but not her sister. Yeong-hye had said nothing, only stood and watched the flaming poplars kindled by the evening light. Had they run away from home that evening, as Yeong-hye had suggested, would it all have been different? At the family gathering that day, if she'd been more forceful when she grabbed their father's arm before he struck Yeong-hye in the face, would it all have been different then? And what about when she first took Yeong-hye to be introduced to her future husband, Mr. Chong? He'd come across as somewhat cold. She hadn't taken to him at all. What would have happened if she'd acted on instinct and refused to let the marriage go forward? There'd been a time when she could spend hours like this, weighing up all the variables that might have contributed to determining Yeong-hye's fate. Of course, it was entirely in vain, this act of mentally picking up and counting the puduk stones that had been laid out on the board of her sister's life. More than that, it wasn't even possible. But she couldn't stop her thoughts from running onto her ex-husband. If only she hadn't married him. He called her just once. It was around 9 months ago, and close on midnight. Perhaps he'd been calling from somewhere far away, because there was a brief lag after the sound of the coin tumbling. "I want to see Jiwoo." His oh-so-familiar voice, low and tense, she could tell he was struggling. To sound composed was like a blunt knife stabbing her in the chest. "Couldn't you let me see him? Just one time?" So that was what he'd called to say. Not to say he was sorry. Not to beg for her forgiveness. Only to talk about the child. He didn't even ask whether Yeong-hye was all right. She'd always known how sensitive he was. A man whose self-esteem was so easily wounded. Who quickly became frustrated if the situation didn't go his way. She knew that if she refused him this one more time, it would probably be a very long time before he contacted her again. Even though she was aware of this, no, because she was aware of it, she hung up without answering. A public telephone booth in the middle of the night. Worn-out sneakers, shabby clothes. A despairing face, no longer young. She shook her head, trying to erase those images from her mind. Whenever she thought of him now, those thoughts were quietly overlaid with the way he'd looked. When he tried to throw himself over the railing of Yeong-hye's veranda, trying to fly like a bird. All those scenes of flight he'd included in his videos, and yet, when he needed it most, such flight had proved beyond him. "I don't know you," she muttered, tightening her grip on the receiver, which she'd hung back in the cradle but was still clutching. "So, there's no need for us to forgive each other. Because I don't know you." When the phone rang again, she pulled out the cord. The next morning she connected it up again, but, as she'd predicted, he didn't call again. Time passes. Now Yeong-hye's eyes are closed. Is she sleeping? Can she smell the fruit her sister put to her lips? Just now? In-hye looks at Yeong-hye's prominent cheekbones, her hollow eyes, her sunken cheeks. She feels her sister's ragged breath. She gets up and walks over to the window, where the dark gray of the sky is gradually lightening, the landscape growing brighter at the edges. The light touches upon Mount Cheongsong's forest, rekindling its summer colors. The place where Yeong-hye was discovered that night must be somewhere over on that slope. "I heard something," Yeong-hye had said, lying hooked up to the drip. "I went there because I heard something calling me. I don't hear it anymore now. I was just standing there waiting." When In-hye asked, "What were you waiting for?" a fever came into Yeong-hye's eyes. Her right hand was the one with the needle in it. She reached out with her left and grabbed In-hye's hand. In-hye was shocked by how strong her grip was. It melted in the rain, all melted. I'd been just about to go down into the earth. There was nothing else for it if I wanted to turn myself upside down again, you see. Heju's excited tone jolts In-hye out of these memories. "What can we do about Yeong-hye? They're saying she might die." To In-hye, Heju's words sounded like the deafening roar of a plane taking off. There is one memory that In-hye has never been able to tell anyone else about and probably never will. April 2 years ago. The spring of the year when her husband made that video of Yeong-hye. In-hye had bled from her vagina for close on a month, on and off. She'd never been able to understand why, But for some reason, every time she washed her blood-soaked pants, she would recall the way in, which the blood from Yeong-hye's wrist had spurted out into the air. Every day, she decided she would go for a medical examination the next day, then when the next day came she would postpone it. Again. She was afraid of going to the hospital. If it was a serious disease, how much time might she have left?
A year.
6 months. Or 3 months. For the first time, she became vividly aware of how much of her life she had spent with her husband. It had been a period of time utterly devoid of happiness and spontaneity. A time that she'd so far managed to get through only by using up every last reserve of perseverance and consideration. All of it self-inflicted. On the morning when she'd finally mustered the courage to go to the obstetrics and gynecology department, the one where Ji-woo had been born, she'd stood on the open-air platform at Yeong-hye Station and waited for the train, which was taking an unusually long time to arrive. Opposite the platform was a row of temporary buildings, their steel structures now decaying, and wild grasses straggling up between the sleepers on the edges over which no trains passed.
The feeling that she had
never really lived in this world caught her by surprise. It was a fact. She had never lived. Even as a child, as far back as she could remember, she had done nothing but endure. She had believed in her own inherent goodness, her humanity, and lived accordingly, never causing anyone harm. Her devotion to doing things the right way had been unflagging. All her success had depended on it, and she would have gone on like that indefinitely. She didn't understand why, but faced with those decaying buildings and straggling grasses, she was nothing but a child who had never lived. She'd fought down her feeling of shame and managed to stop trembling before getting up onto the
bed.
The middle-aged male doctor then pushed a cold abdominal scope deep into her vagina and removed a tongue-like polyp that had been stuck to the vaginal wall. Her body flinched away from the sharp pain. "So this is why you've been bleeding." Well, it came away cleanly, so the bleeding should start to lessen in a few days and then stop altogether. Your ovaries are completely fine, so there's nothing for you to worry about there. There wasn't even a scrap of happiness that she could glean from this. Instead of a serious illness, a possibility that had caused her no end of worry over the past month, it had been nothing but a minor niggle. Back on the platform at Yeong-hye, it wasn't only the pain from the operation that caused her legs to tremble. When the train eventually roared into the platform, she staggered behind one of the metal chairs and hit herself, afraid that something inside her would make her throw herself in front of the solid mass of the train. How to explain the 4 months or so that followed on from that day? The bleeding continued for around another 2 weeks, then the cut healed, and it stopped. But she felt as though there were still an open wound inside her body. Somehow, it seemed this wound had in fact grown bigger than her, that her whole body was being pulled into its pitch-black maw. She looked on in silence as spring passed and summer arrived. The outfits sported by her female customers grew progressively shorter and more colorful. As always, she smiled at the customers, never failed to recommend additional products or give discounts where appropriate, and made sure to pack up a complimentary sample with every purchase. She put up posters advertising new products in carefully chosen locations around the shop, where they would catch the customer's eyes, and handled with ease those occasions when skincare consultants hadn't got good feedback and therefore had to be replaced. But in the evenings, when she left her employees and walked through the sweltering night streets, brimming with music and crowded with couples on dates, she could feel that gaping black wound still sucking at her, pulling her in. She dragged her sweat-soaked body through the street and away from the crowds. It had happened around the time when those sweltering summer days had started to cool down a little, at least in the mornings and evenings. When he arrived back at the house early one morning, sneaking in like a thief after several days away, got into bed and tried to put his arms around her, she pushed
him away.
"I'm tired," I said. "I'm really tired." "Just put up with it for a minute," he said. She remembered how it had been Those words had run through her semi-conscious mind again and again. Still half asleep, she'd managed to get through it by thinking to herself that it was all right. It would just be this one time. It would be over soon. She could put up with it. The pain and shame had been washed away by the deep, exhausted sleep she slipped into immediately afterward.
And yet,
later, at the breakfast table, she would all of a sudden find herself wanting to stab herself in the eyes with her chopsticks or pour the boiling water from the kettle over her head. Once her husband had fallen asleep, the bedroom was still and silent again. She picked up Ji-woo, who had been sleeping on his side, and put him back down so that he was lying on his back, seeing as she did so how pitiful they must appear, mother and child faintly outlined in the darkness. There was nothing the matter.
it was a fact.
Everything would be fine as long as she just kept going, just carried on with her life, as she always had done. In any case, there was no other way. She left the bedroom and looked out of the dark blue veranda window. The toys that Ji-woo had been playing with last night, the sofa and the television, the black door flaps underneath the sink, and the splotches of grease on the gas range. It was as though she were seeing these things for the first time, walking around the house as though she'd never been there before. A strange pain gripped her
Chest.
It was an oppressive, constricting feeling, as if the walls of the house were slowly closing in. She opened the wardrobe door and took out the purple cotton t-shirt. Its color had faded because Ji-woo had liked it when he was nursing, and so she'd worn it often in the house. It was the kind of thing she liked to wear when she was ill or just not feeling her best. Even though she'd washed it countless times, that milk and newborn baby smell still gave her a sense of security. But this time it didn't work. The pain in her chest got worse. Her breathing grew shallow, and she had to make an effort to try to breathe more deeply. She sat down on the sofa. Her eyes followed the second hand on the clock as it ticked around, and she made another effort to regulate her breathing. To her surprise, there was still no improvement.
A
feeling of déjà vu crept up on her then, a feeling of having already experienced this same moment countless times. The proof of her internal pain had been set in front of her, as though this were something she'd spent a long time preparing for, as though she'd been waiting for just this moment. All of this is meaningless. I can't take it anymore. I can't go on any longer.
I don't want to.
She took one more look around at the various objects inside the house. They did not belong to her, just like her life had never belonged to her. Her life was no more than a ghostly pageant of exhausted endurance, no more real than a television drama. Death, who now stood by her side, was as familiar to her as a family member missing for a long time but now returned. She got up, shivering, and went over to the room where the toys had been left scattered. Every evening for the past week, she would take down the mobile which Ji-woo had helped her to decorate, and begin to untie the thick cord. It was wound so tightly that it hurt the tips of her fingers, but she continued patiently until the final knot was untied. She rolled up the colored paper and cellophane, which had been decorated with stars, and tidied it away in a basket, then rolled up the cord and put it in her trouser pocket. She slipped on a pair of sandals, pushed open the heavy front door, and went out.
She walked down
the 5 flights of stairs. It was still dark outside. The huge apartment building was illuminated only by the light she herself had left on. She carried on walking through the gate at the rear of the apartment complex and up the dark, narrow path to the mountain. The folds of the mountain looked deeper than usual in the blue-black darkness. It was so early that even the old-timers who diligently went out to collect mineral water at dawn were still asleep in their
beds.
She walked on, head bowed. There was something on her face, sweat or tears. She wasn't sure, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand. The pain feels like a hole swallowing her up, a source of intense fear, and yet, at the same time, a strange, quiet peace. Time passes. Yeong-hye sits back down. She opens the lid of the last container. She takes hold of Yeong-hye's stiff hand and pulls it toward the plums, running her sister's fingers over their smooth skin. She curls those gaunt fingers around one of the plums, makes her hold it. Plums are one of the fruits that Yeong-hye used to like. In-hye remembered that, as a child, Yeong-hye would sometimes roll one around inside her mouth for a while without biting into it, saying that she liked the way it felt. But now her sister's hand is limp and unresponsive. Her fingernails have become as thin as paper. Yeong-hye. Her voice sounds dry and rasping in the silence of the ward. No answer. She brings her face up close to Yeong-hye's. Just then, though it seems unbelievable, Yeong-hye's eyelids flutter. Open. Yeong-hye. She peers into her sister's empty black pupils, but all that she sees reflected there is her own face. The strength of her own disappointment takes her by surprise, plunging her into
despair.
"You're actually insane." It's a thought she hasn't been able to countenance these past few days, but now, for the first time, she asks Yeong-hye the question. Have you really lost your mind? An inscrutable fear makes her draw back from her sister, but she remains seated. The stillness of the ward, without even the sound of breathing to break the silence, is like waterlogged cotton wool, stopping up her ears. Perhaps, she mutters to herself. Perhaps it's simpler than I thought. She hesitates, falling silent for a while. You're crazy, and so, instead of completing the thought, she reaches out and touches her index finger to her sister's philtrum. A faint breath tickles her finger, warm and regular. Yeong-hye's lips twitch minutely. This pain and insomnia that, unbeknownst to others, now has In-hye in its grip. Might Yeong-hye have passed through this same phase herself a long time ago, and more quickly than most people? Might Yeong-hye's current condition be the natural progression from what her sister has recently been experiencing? Perhaps, at some point, Yeong-hye had simply let fall the slender thread that had kept her connected with everyday life. During the past insomniac months, In-hye had sometimes felt as though she were living in a state of total chaos. If it hadn't been for Ji-woo, if it hadn't been for the sense of responsibility she felt toward him, perhaps she too might have relinquished her grip on that
thread.
The only times when the pain simply, miraculously ceases are those moments just after she laughs. Something Ji-woo says, or does, makes her laugh, and then immediately afterward, she is left blank, empty even of pain. At such times, the sheer fact of her having laughed seems unbelievable, and makes her laugh again. Admittedly, this laughter always seems more manic than happy, but Ji-woo loves to see it all the same. Was this it, Mum? Was this what made you laugh? Then Ji-woo will repeat whatever it is he'd just been doing, such as pursing his lips and using his hands to mimic a horn growing out of his forehead, or else making a clattering sound, sticking his head between his legs and calling out "Mum, Mum" in a silly voice. The more she laughs, the more he ups the ante with his clowning. By the time he finishes, he will have run through all the secret mysteries of laughter that human beings have ever understood, mobilizing everything at his disposal. There is no way for him to know how guilty it makes his mother feel, seeing such a young child go to such lengths just to wring a bit of apparent happiness from her, or that her laughter will all eventually run out. Life is such a strange thing, she thinks, once she has stopped laughing. Even after certain things have happened to them, no matter how awful the experience, people still go on eating and drinking, going to the toilet and washing themselves, living, in other words. And sometimes they even laugh out loud. And they probably have these same thoughts, too, and when they do, it must make them cheerlessly recall all the sadness they'd briefly managed to forget. But lying next to the small, tanned body of her son, after sleep draws itself down over his guiltless young face, the night begins again for her. A time when there is neither sight nor sound of any other living thing, as long as eternity, as bottomless as a swamp. If she curls up in the empty bathtub and closes her eyes, the dark woods close in around her. The dark lines of rain drill into Yeong-hye's body like spears. Her skinny bare feet are covered in mud. When In-hye shakes her head to dispel the image, summer trees in broad daylight flicker in front of her eyes like huge green fireworks. Is this because of the hallucination Yeong-hye told her about? The innumerable trees she's seen over the course of all her life, the undulating forests that blanket the continents like a heartless sea, envelop her exhausted body and lift her up. Only fragments of cities, small towns and roads are visible, floating on the roof of the forest like islands or bridges, slowly being swept away somewhere, borne on those warm waves. There's no way for In-hye to know what on earth those waves are saying, or what those trees she'd seen at the end of the narrow mountain path, clustered together like green flames in the early morning. Half-light had been saying. Whatever it was, there had been no warmth in it. Whatever the words were, they hadn't been words of comfort, words that would help her pick herself up. Instead, they were merciless, and the trees that had spoken them were a frighteningly chill form of life. Even when she turned about on the spot and searched in all directions, In-hye hadn't been able to find a tree that would take her life from her. Some of the trees had refused to accept her. They just stood there, stubborn and solemn yet alive as animals, bearing up the weight of their own massive bodies. Time passes. In-hye puts the lids back on all of the containers. She packs everything up into her bag, starting with the thermos. She zips the bag closed. What other dimension might Yeong-hye's soul have passed into, having shrugged off flesh like a snake shedding its skin? In-hye recalled how Yeong-hye had looked when she'd been standing on her hands. Had Yeong-hye mistaken the hospital's concrete floor for the soft earth of the woods? Had her body metamorphosed into a sturdy trunk, with white roots sprouting from her hands and clutching the black soil? Had her legs stretched high up into the air, while her arms extended all the way down to the earth's very core, her back stretched taut to support this two-pronged spurt of growth? As the sun's rays soaked down through Yeong-hye's body, had the water that was saturating the soil been drawn up through her cells, eventually to bloom from her crotch as flowers? When Yeong-hye had balanced upside down and stretched out every fiber in her body, had these things been awakened in her soul? But seriously, In-hye said out loud, "What the hell? You're dying," she said, louder this time. "You're lying there in that bed, and dying. Nothing else." She presses her lips tightly together, clenching her teeth so savagely the blood shows through, wrestling with the desire to get hold of Yeong-hye's insensible face, to shake her wraith-like body hard and hurl her back down on the bed. Now, there's no more time left. In-hye shoulders her bag and pushes back the chair. Walking with a stoop, she hurries out of the ward. When she turns her head, Yeong-hye's body is still rigid and unmoving beneath the sheet. In-hye clenches her teeth even harder. She walks along to the lobby. A nurse with bobbed hair walks up to the table in the lobby carrying a small white plastic basket and sits down. In the basket are various nail clippers. The patients line up and each in turn is given a pair of clippers. Each selection takes a long time, as if the patients are trying to decide which pair will suit them best. On the other side of the lobby, a ponytailed nurse's aide cuts the nails of the dementia sufferers. In-hye stands quietly and observes the scene. Anything sharp or narrow that could be used to pierce or cut, anything with a long cord that could be wrapped around a throat, is forbidden. Partly this is to prevent the patients from harming others, but the main concern is that they would want to harm themselves. In-hye scans their faces, each of them bent over their hands, absorbed in the task of getting their nails cut before their time with the clippers is up. The clock on the wall indicates 5 minutes past 2. A doctor's white coat flits by the glass door, and the entrance to the lobby opens. It is Yeong-hye's doctor. He turns and locks the door behind him, his movements swift and practiced. No doubt the same could be said at any large hospital, but here, at a psychiatric hospital, the authority of the medical specialist seems even more pronounced. Perhaps it is because the patients here are not free to leave. They flock around the doctor as though they have just discovered their messiah.
Just a minute, doctor.
Did you call my wife? If you could just tell her that's it okay for me to be discharged, here's my wife's number. If you'd just give her a call. Doctor, please change my medication. There's this incessant ringing sound in my ears. Doctor, won't you speak to him? He's always hitting me. I can't cope anymore. What now, you're at it too? Why are you kicking me? I'm telling you to talk to me. The doctor gives the woman a relaxed, direct smile, clearly designed to appease. When did I kick you? Now hang on, I need you all to talk to me one at a time. When did this ringing in the ear start? The woman stamps her foot loudly, impatient at having to wait, the feelings contorting her face, seeming more like misery and anxiety than violent inclinations. Just then the door to the lobby opens again, and another doctor comes in, one that In-hye hasn't seen before. That's the internist, Hee-ju says. In-hye hadn't noticed her arrive.
Apparently each psychiatric
institution has an internist permanently on hand. This man seems young, though perhaps he just has a young-looking face, and gives the impression of being intelligent but cold. Eventually, Yeong-hye's doctor detaches himself from the gaggle of patients and strides over to In-hye. She takes a step back, without realizing it. Have you spoken to your sisters? From what I could see, it didn't look like she was conscious. It might seem that way on the surface, but every single one of her muscles is tensed. It isn't that. She's not conscious exactly. Rather, it's as if her conscious mind is so completely concentrated on something or somewhere that she isn't aware of her immediate surroundings. When she's in that state, and we force her out of it, if you saw what happens, then you'd know for sure that she'd been awake the whole time. The doctor seems sincere and a little tense. It can be a difficult thing for a family member to witness. If we decide that your presence is complicating things, it's best if you get out of the way quickly. I understand, In-hye says. It's just. The doctor cuts her off. I'm sure everything will work out fine. With Yeong-hye's twisting, struggling body slung over his shoulder fireman style, the carer walks down the corridor and into an empty two-person ward. In-hye waits for the other medical staff to file in, then follows cautiously. The doctor was right. Yeong-hye is definitely conscious. In fact, her thrashing is so wild and rough it's difficult to believe that she's the same woman as the one who was lying completely immobile only a short while ago. A barely comprehensible yell erupts from her throat. Leave me alone. Leave me alone. Two carers and a nurse's aide grapple with her struggling form, forcing her down onto the bed. They bind her arms and legs. Please step outside, the male nurse says to In-hye as she stands there hesitating. It's difficult for family members to watch. Please go outside. Yeong-hye instantly turns to In-hye, fixing her with her shining eyes. Her yelling intensifies and a continuous torrent of words streams out. Her bound limbs writhe, compelled by some unknown impulse, as if she were trying to throw herself at In-hye. In-hye steps forward, closer to her sister. Without realizing what she is doing, Yeong-hye's skinny arms flail about, wasted away to nothing but
bone.
I don't like it. For the first time, Yeong-hye enunciates clearly, though her voice still sounds like the roar of some savage beast. I don't like it. I don't like eating. In-hye clasps Yeong-hye's contorted cheeks in both hands. Yeong-hye. Yeong-hye. The look in Yeong-hye's eyes as she shudders with terror claws at In-hye. Please go outside. You're only making things more difficult. The carers grab In-hye by the armpits and lift her up. With no time to resist, she is pushed through the open door and out into the corridor. The nurse who had been standing outside takes her by the arm. Please stay here. She'll be calmer without you in there. Yeong-hye's doctor pulls on a pair of surgical gloves and spreads an even layer of jelly over the long, slender tube that the head nurse hands to him. In the meantime, one of the carers is having to use all his strength to try to hold Yeong-hye's head still. As soon as they approach her with the tube, Yeong-hye's face flushes crimson, and she manages to shake herself free of the carer's grip. It is just, as the nurse had said, impossible to know where such strength is coming from. In-hye takes a step forward, faintly dazed, but the nurse grabs her arm and holds her back. Eventually, the carer wrestles Yeong-hye's sunken cheeks back into his strong grasp, and the doctor inserts the tube into her nose. "Damn it, it's blocked," the doctor exclaims. Yeong-hye has opened her mouth as wide as it will go, thereby managing to close up her gullet around the uvula so that the tube is pushed out. The internist, who had been waiting to send the thin gruel flowing into the tube through the syringe, furrows his brow. Yeong-hye's doctor removes the tube from her nose. "Right, let's try one more time. Quicker this time." Again, jelly is rubbed onto the tube. Again, the carer pits his robust physique against Yeong-hye's wasted strength, clamping his hands around her head. Again, the tube is inserted into Yeong-hye's
Nose.
"It's in. That's it now." A quick sigh escapes from the doctor's mouth. The internist's idle hands are busy all of a sudden. He starts to send the gruel through the syringe. The nurse, who has been holding In-hye's arm, gives her a squeeze and whispers, "It's worked. It's a success.
Now she'll be put to sleep.
Otherwise, she might vomit, you see." As soon as the head nurse gets out the tranquilizer injection, the nurse's aide gives a sharp scream. In-hye shakes off the other nurse's hand and dashes back into the room. "Out of the way, all of you. Get away from her." In-hye grabs Yeong-hye's doctor by the shoulder as he bends over the bed and yanks him back. She stands and looks down at Yeong-hye. The nurse's aide, who had been holding the tube, has blood spatters on her face. The blood is gushing out of the tube, out of Yeong-hye's mouth. The internist takes a step back, still holding the syringe. "Take it out. Take the tube out, quickly." In-hye is unaware of the shrill scream coming from her own mouth as she feels the carer try to grapple her away. Meanwhile, Yeong-hye's doctor is finding it difficult to extract the long tube as his patient throws her head about. "Calm down, calm down. Calm," the doctor yells at Yeong-hye. "Tranquilizers." The head nurse tries to hand him the syringe.
"Don't."
In-hye screams, her voice drawn out like a wail. "Stop it. Don't. Please don't." She bites the arm of the carer holding her and throws herself forward again. "What the hell? You bitch," the carer groans. In-hye takes Yeong-hye in her arms, soaking her blouse with the blood her sister has vomited up. "Stop it, for God's sake. Please stop." In-hye grabs the wrist of the head nurse, the one who is holding the syringe with the tranquilizer, as Yeong-hye quietly convulses against her chest. Yeong-hye's blood is splashed all over the doctor's white gown, even on his rolled-up sleeves. In-hye stares blankly at the splatter pattern. A whirling galaxy of bloody stars. "We need to transfer Yeong-hye to the main hospital right away. Please go to Seoul. They'll have to give her a protein injection into one of her carotid arteries to stop the gastric bleeding. The effect won't last long, but it's the only way if you want to keep her alive." In-hye takes the letter requesting Yeong-hye's admittance to the main hospital, which has just been drawn up, puts it in her bag, and leaves the nurse's room. She heads for the bathroom and manages to make it into one of the cubicles before her legs crumple beneath her, and she falls to her knees in front of the toilet. Quietly, she begins to vomit milky tea mixed with yellow stomach acid.
"Idiot."
Her trembling lips repeat the word as she washes her face in front of the mirror. "Idiot. It's your body. You can treat it however you please. The only area where you're free to do just as you like. And even that doesn't turn out how you wanted." When she lifts her head, the face she sees reflected in the mirror is wet. Eyes from which so much blood has spilled in her dreams. Eyes from which that blood always refused to be wiped away, no matter how fiercely she scrubbed at it with her hands. But the woman's face is not crying, not now. It's only staring wordlessly back at her, like always, betraying not even the faintest hint of emotion. The wailing cry that tore at her ears a little while ago was so raw, so full of anguish. She finds it difficult to believe it came from her. She reels along the corridor, staggering like a drunk. Desperately trying to keep her balance, she
makes her way toward the lobby.
All of a sudden the sunlight is pouring through the window, brightening the gloomy space. It's been a long time since Yeong-hye has seen such light. Some of the patients are sensitive to the light and grow agitated, while the rest of them flock over to the window. Gabbling excitably, a woman wearing ordinary clothes walks over to Yeong-hye. Yeong-hye narrows her eyes, her vision swimming, struggling to make out the woman's face. It's Hee-ju. The whites of her eyes are red. Perhaps she's been crying again. Has she always felt things so deeply? Or is it just because she's a patient here, one who's emotionally unstable? How is Yeong-hye? If you go now. Yeong-hye takes hold of the other woman's hand. I've been really grateful. Yeong-hye finds herself surprised by the impulse to reach out and put her arms around the broad shoulders of this crying woman. But she doesn't act on it. Instead, she turns and looks over at the patients who are peering anxiously out of the window. They may be nervous, but they're also earnest, captivated, as if longing to walk through the glass and find themselves outside. They're trapped here, Yeong-hye thinks. Just like this woman, Hee-ju. Just like Yeong-hye. Her inability to embrace Hee-ju is bound up with the guilt she feels over having had Yeong-hye incarcerated here. Rapid footsteps can be heard, coming from the eastern corridor. A moment later, two carers appear, taking short, quick steps. They are carrying Yeong-hye on a stretcher, now cleaned of blood, and with her eyes closed. Yeong-hye's face is like that of a baby napping after a bath. Hee-ju reaches out to take Yeong-hye's wasted hand in her own rough palm, and Yeong-hye turns her head so that she won't have to watch. The summer woods are dense and luxuriant beyond the windshield of the ambulance. In the waning afternoon light, the rain on the leaves glitters intensely, kindling a green fire. Yeong-hye brushes Yeong-hye's hair, still slightly damp from when the nurse's aide had washed the blood off, back behind her ears. She remembers rubbing soap over her sisters individually, protruding vertebrae, all those times when they had bathed together as children, those evenings when she had washed her back and hair for her. It occurs to her that Yeong-hye's hair now reminds her of Ji-woo's when he was still in swaddling clothes. She feels her son's small fingers brush her eyebrows, and loneliness sweeps over her. She gets her mobile out of the inner pocket of her bag. It's been off all day. Now she switches it on and dials the number of the woman who lives next door. Hi, it's Ji-woo's mom. I've had to stop by the hospital because of a relative. Yes, something. Suddenly, no, the bus will be at the main gate at 5:50. You see, yes, it's almost always exactly on time. I won't be very late. If I'm late, I'll have to take Ji-woo and then go back to the hospital. How can he sleep there? Thank you so much. You have my number, right? I'll call again later. She flips the phone closed and realizes how long it's been since she left Ji-woo in the care of someone else. After her husband left, she'd made it a general rule always to spend evenings and weekends with the child. She frowns. Drowsiness presses in on her, and she leans against the window. She sits there with her eyes closed and thinks. Ji-woo will be grown up soon. He'll be able to read on his own, see other people on his own. Somehow or other, he will inevitably get to hear about all that happened. And how on earth will she explain it to him? He is a sensitive child, prone to minor illnesses, but he is also a happy child.
How
will she make sure he stays this way? She recalls the sight of those two naked bodies, twined together like jungle creepers. Of course it had shocked her at the time, and yet, oddly enough, the more time went by, the less she thought of it as something sexual. Covered with flowers and leaves and twisting green stems, those bodies were so altered it was as though they no longer belonged to human beings. The writhing movements of those bodies made it seem as though they were trying to shuck off the human. What was it that had made him want to film such a thing? Had he staked everything of himself on those strange, desolate images? Staked everything and lost everything? There was this photo of you, Mom, flying about in the wind. I was looking at the sky, okay, and there was a bird, and I heard it say, I'm your mum. And these two hands came out of the bird's body. This happened a long while back, when Jiwoo's tongue still tripped over certain words. The strange vague sadness of a child near tears had surprised her, she remembers. What's all this, hey? Are you saying it was a sad dream? Still lying down, Jiwoo had rubbed at his eyes with his little fists. What did the bird look like?
What color was it?
White, yeah, it was pretty. Sucking in a quavering breath, the boy had buried his head in his mother's chest. His sobs desolated her, just like every time he went to great efforts to make her laugh. There was no demand he had that she might fulfill, nor was he trying to ask for help. He was crying, simply because he felt sad. It must have meant it was a mummy bird, she'd said, hoping to placate him. Jiwoo shook his head, still pressed up against her chest. She slipped a hand under his chin and tilted his head up. Look, your mum's right here. I haven't changed into a white bird, you see? His lips wavered into a faint, uncertain smile. His nose was as shiny as a puppy's. You see, it was just a dream. But was that really true? Right then, in the ambulance, she wasn't sure. Had it really been just a dream, a mere coincidence? Because that had been the morning when she turned her back on the sun. As it rose over the silent trees and retraced her steps back down the mountain, wearing her faded purple t-shirt. It's just a dream. That's what she tells herself, out loud and vehement, every time she recalls how Jiwoo looked at her that day. This time she's startled by her own voice, opens her eyes wide, and stares confusedly. About her. The ambulance is still racing down the steep road. She smooths her hair back, knows she should see to it, knows it must look a state. Her hand trembles visibly. She can't explain, not even to herself, how easy it had been to make the decision to abandon her
Child.
It was a crime, cruel and irresponsible. She would never be able to convince herself otherwise. And so it was also something she would never be able to confess, never be forgiven for. The truth of the matter was something she simply felt, horribly clearly. If her husband and Yeong-hye hadn't smashed through all the boundaries, if everything hadn't splintered apart, then perhaps she was the one who would have broken down, and if she'd let that happen, if she'd let go of the thread, she might never have found it again. In that case, would the blood that Yeong-hye had vomited today have burst from her in Hye's chest instead? With a low moan, Yeong-hye struggles into consciousness, afraid that she might be going to vomit. Blood again. In-hye casts around for a hand towel and holds it to her sister's mouth. Yeong-hye doesn't vomit. Instead, she opens her eyes. Her black pupils fix on In-hye. What is stirring behind those eyes? What is she harboring inside her, beyond the reach of her sisters? Imagination? What terror, what anger, what agony, what hell? Yeong-hye. In-hye says. Her voice is drained of all emotion. Yeong-hye averts her head, as though wanting to evade her sister's question, as though the last thing in the world she wants to do right now is to give her any kind of answer.
In-hye
reaches out a trembling hand, then almost immediately lets it drop. In-hye presses her lips together. It's come back to her, all of a sudden, the mountain path she walked down early that morning. The dew that wet her sandals had chilled her otherwise bare feet. There had been no tears, nothing like that, because at the time she hadn't understood. She hadn't understood what that cold moisture had been trying to say as it drenched her battered body and spread through her dried-up veins. It had simply leached through into her flesh, down to her very
bones.
Then In-hye opens her mouth. What I'm trying to say, she whispers to Yeong-hye.
The
ambulance chassis rattles over a hollow in the road. In-hye squeezes Yeong-hye's shoulders. Perhaps this is all a kind of dream. She bows her head. But then, as though suddenly struck by something, she brings her mouth right up to Yeong-hye's ear and carries on speaking, forming the words carefully one by one. I have dreams too, you know. dreams, and I could let myself dissolve into them, let them take me over, but surely the dream isn't all there is? We have to wake up at some point, don't we? Because then she raises her head again. The ambulance is rounding the last bend in the road, leaving Mount Cheongsong. She sees a black bird flying up toward the dark clouds. The summer sunlight dazzles her eyes, makes them sting, and her gaze cannot follow the bird's flight anymore. Quietly, she breathes in. The trees by the side of the road are blazing, green fire undulating like the rippling flanks of a massive animal, wild and savage. Yeong-hye stares fiercely at the trees, as if waiting for an answer, as if protesting against something. The look in her eyes is dark and insistent.